She was just a secretary, trying to survive. He was a billionaire CEO, too broken to love again. They weren't supposed to meet, especially not in the dim, echoing silence of an underground parking lot, where her past came back to claim her. Why did Caleb Whitmore, a man known for keeping the world at arm's length, step in to save Evelyn that night? What made him offer her safety, not in the form of bodyguards or security systems, but a cabin, a child, and something dangerously close to love? What kind of man proposes a deal that involves trust without affection? And what kind of woman says yes, not knowing if she's escaping danger or stepping into another kind of storm? This isn't a story about falling in love at first sight. It's about what happens when two wounded souls collide and slowly, tenderly, begin to build something neither of them believed they deserved. If you've ever run from your past, if you've ever wondered whether love can find you again, then this story was written for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. Evelyn Carter had spent the last 3 years building invisible fences, changing locks, deleting traces, and walking home beneath different streetlights each week. But as she stepped into the dim, cold stillness of the underground parking garage, she realized something painful. Some fears learn how to pick any lock. They find you, even in the places you swore were safe. Her heels echoed faintly as she walked across the concrete floor, the tap-tap rhythm almost calming until it wasn't. The air was heavy, a strange mix of exhaust, winter chill, and silence that felt too deliberate. She glanced at her watch just after 7 p.m. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. She stayed late finishing expense reports, but deep down, she knew the real reason. The office felt safer than her apartment. Lonelier, perhaps, but safer. Then she heard it. A soft shuffle. A step not meant to be noticed, but not quite careful enough. She didn't turn around right away. Her body stiffened. Her breath caught. She could already feel the cold sweat forming at the base of her neck. And then the voice. Eve, 2 years, 2 whole years since she'd last heard him say her name out loud. Randall. He stepped into the yellow glow of the overhead lights, looking older, but not weaker. His coat was heavy, but open, like he didn't care about the cold. Same eyes, same stare. That half smirk that once meant charm, but now only whispered danger. She froze in place, hand tightening around her keys. "I just want to talk," he said, softly at first. "You never gave me a real chance to fix things." Evelyn turned slowly. Her voice barely rose above the hum of nearby generators. "You need to leave." He took a step forward. "Come on, Evelyn. We were married. That means something. You can't just erase me." She backed up, inching toward her car, but he closed the gap quickly, anger flaring. His hand grabbed her wrist too tight, too sudden. Panic surged through her, shallow breath clashing against the freezing air. "I said, let go. I'm not done," he snapped, tightening his grip. "You think you can just run off, start over with a new name, new job? You owe me," she said. "Let go." The voice came from behind them, calm, deep, and cut with steel. Randall paused, his hand still on Evelyn's arm. Slowly, they both turned. A tall figure stepped out from behind a dark SUV. He was wrapped in a long black wool coat, tailored and sharp. His gloves were still on, his eyes gray. Unreadable, didn't blink. Caleb Whitmore. Evelyn's boss. The billionaire founder of Whitmore Technologies. She'd seen him walk through boardrooms like they were extensions of his own mind, commanding attention without ever raising his voice. Randall straightened, jaw clenched. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Caleb replied, evenly. "Remove your hand from her. Now." Randall hesitated. Something about the way Caleb stood shoulders square, gaze level, made even his bravado falter. He released Evelyn's arm, stepping back, eyes narrowing. "You think money makes you untouchable?" he hissed. "No," Caleb said. "But I don't tolerate threats. To anyone under my protection." Randall spat on the ground beside him. "She's not yours." "No," Caleb agreed, voice steady. But you've already made it clear she's not yours either. A long silence stretched. Then Randall turned and walked off, shoulders stiff, boots pounding against the floor with more noise than needed. He disappeared into the ramp's curve, swallowed by shadow. Evelyn stood frozen, her hands still shaking slightly. Caleb didn't speak right away. He didn't reach out, either. He just stood beside her, quietly, giving her space. "Are you all right?" he finally asked. She nodded, though it wasn't fully true. "Your car doesn't look safe to drive," he said, glancing at the dented door and side mirror barely hanging on. "Let me take you home." "I can manage," she replied automatically. "I insist." There was no force in his voice, just quiet finality, and something else, something like recognition. Without another word, she followed him to his car. The silence between them on the ride was almost soothing. No questions, no pity, just warmth from the heater and the occasional sound of tires sliding softly over icy roads. When they reached her apartment, he walked her to the front door. She fumbled with her keys, embarrassed by the chipped paint on her door frame and the missing porch light bulb. But when she opened the door, he stopped her. The lock's been tampered with. She looked down. He was right. The metal was scratched. It hadn't been like that this morning. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. Not for a long moment. "If you need anything," he said, finally, "you know how to find me." She gave him the smallest nod, then stepped inside. When the door clicked shut behind her, Evelyn leaned her back against it, letting the quiet fall around her like a heavy blanket. Her breath shook, not from the cold, not from Randall, from the way Caleb had looked at her, measured, steady, and not the way a man looks at someone broken, not with pity, but with something she wasn't ready to name. Not yet. Caleb Whitmore had never driven a colleague home, not once. He valued distance the kind that kept business professional, emotions manageable, and life ordered. But as he watched Evelyn Carter fumble with her keys outside her apartment, her breath hitching in the cold, her shoulders drawn in like she was bracing for more than weather he knew. This wasn't about protocol. This was about instinct, and he wasn't about to leave her standing alone in the dark. The ride began in silence, except for the low hum of the car's heater and the occasional sweep of the wipers against the windshield. Snow had begun falling again, soft and steady, blurring the city lights into gentle smudges behind the glass. Evelyn sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look at him. Her profile was calm, but he could feel the tension radiating from her like static. After a few blocks, he spoke. "Was that your ex-husband?" Oh, pause. She adjusted the strap of her purse, but didn't turn her head. Yes, no elaboration, no explanation, just a word, flat and final. "He's been following you?" Another pause. "I don't know. Sometimes I think I see him. Other times I think it's just habit. Fear makes ghosts out of everything." He glanced at her, but she kept her eyes forward, focused on the snowy streets winding ahead. "You didn't tell anyone at work," he said. She smiled small, tired. "And say what? That I used to belong to a man who broke more than furniture when he was angry, that I spend every evening checking my locks twice, sometimes 3 times. A beat of silence stretched between them. I didn't want to be that woman," she added, softer. "The broken one?" Caleb didn't respond right away. His fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. There were no right words, only the quiet ones that didn't pretend to fix anything. They turned into a narrow residential street. Her building was small and tucked behind a row of brick townhomes, nearly invisible beneath the frost-covered trees. As she reached for the door handle, he noticed it. The lock on her front door scratched, fresh, obvious to anyone who knew what forced entry looked like. He stepped out behind her as she approached the door. Evelyn hesitated when she saw him following. "I'll be fine," she said, trying to sound firmer than she felt. He didn't argue, but he didn't leave either. She opened the door slowly. The apartment was dim, cold. A narrow hallway led into a living space furnished with second-hand chairs and a table missing one leg support. The wallpaper curled slightly at the corners. A small space heater buzzed quietly in the corner. "I know it's not much," she murmured. Caleb didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the room, mold near the window frame, thin curtains, no visible security system. "It's not safe," he said. She shrugged, trying to keep her voice light. "It's affordable, and I've got deadbolts on both doors," which someone tried to tamper with. She looked down, suddenly ashamed, like she'd invited the danger herself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small business card thicker than most, embossed with his name in silver. He placed it gently on the kitchen counter, beside a chipped ceramic mug. "I own a cabin outside the city, quiet, private. No one knows it exists except a handful of people I trust. If, when you don't feel safe here, call me." Evelyn looked at the card, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" There wasn't judgment in her voice, only disbelief, like she hadn't yet decided whether to be grateful or suspicious. Caleb held her gaze. "Because I don't think anyone's ever really helped you without asking something in return." She didn't answer, not with words. He left a moment later, stepping back into the cold night. The snow had thickened, falling in gentle waves beneath the amber glow of the streetlights. Evelyn stood at the window long after he'd driven away, the card still clutched loosely in her hand. 3 nights later, the phone call came. The office parking lot, same place, same time of day. Evelyn had stayed late again, habit now, more than necessity. She'd almost convinced herself Randall had left town. That maybe, just maybe, the shadows were only shadows. But when she stepped outside, he was there again, waiting by the chain-link fence, watching her. She didn't go to her car. She turned, walked back into the building, and pulled out her phone. Caleb answered on the first ring. Less than an hour later, his SUV pulled up beside the service entrance. Snow was falling hard now, thick, blinding sheets that turned every light into a blurred halo. Evelyn stepped into the car without a word. Caleb reached over and turned the heat up. She didn't speak during the first 5 minutes. Neither did he. But somewhere along the highway, as the city lights disappeared behind them, she let out a long breath. Not quite a sigh, not quite relief, but something softer, something that hadn't been there in a long time. He glanced over. Her hands were still folded, but not clenched this time. And when she finally turned to look out the side mirror, watching Cleveland fade away into a snowy haze, her eyes didn't carry fear. They carried something else. She wasn't running. She was being taken somewhere safe. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn Carter didn't feel like prey. She felt chosen. The cabin stood quietly on the edge of Lake Erie, its wooden frame dusted in snow like sugar on a forgotten cake. The trees surrounding it had shed their leaves weeks ago, their bare arms reaching skyward as if in prayer. The lake beyond had begun to freeze, a glassy sheet of stillness stretching far into the horizon. Evelyn Carter stood at the front porch, gloved hands curled tightly around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. The rising steam drifted upward and vanished into the cold air. Behind her, the door creaked gently in the wind. In front of her, nothing moved. It was beautiful. Postcard, beautiful. And that, she thought, was the part that unsettled her most. No one puts you in a place this serene unless they want something in return. The cabin itself was small but thoughtfully kept. A stone fireplace stood in the main room, and she'd spent the morning learning how to light it with the kindling stored in the tin bucket by the hearth. The walls were lined with pine wood, worn smooth and warm to the touch. In the kitchen, there was a little window with white curtains that danced in the draft when the wind pushed too hard. Every object had a place, and every place had a kind of quiet dignity. And yet, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there. She moved like a guest, careful not to disturb anything. She cleaned dishes immediately after using them, folded every blanket. Even when she sat on the sofa, she perched rather than settled, as if she might need to get up at any moment and explain herself. It wasn't the safety she doubted. The security system was sophisticated, the remote location near impossible to find without exact coordinates. She hadn't seen Randall since that night at the office. Not a shadow, not a whisper. Still, her mind wouldn't let go of the tension. Safety and peace, she was learning, were not the same thing. Caleb came on Friday evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the lake, bleeding soft amber across the snow. She heard the crunch of tires over the driveway before she saw his car. He didn't honk, didn't text, just appeared, like the cold wind that always found the cracks. He brought groceries, a bottle of wine, a book she'd mentioned once, in passing, during a forgotten office conversation. They didn't talk much at first. He set the wine on the counter, she lit the fire. They moved around each other in quiet rhythm, not clumsy, not quite familiar either. Dinner was simple roast chicken, carrots with thyme, and a crusty loaf of sourdough he'd picked up from a bakery in town. They ate at the small wooden table near the window, candles flickering gently between them. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, slow and heavy. He asked her about books. She asked him if he still played piano. He said no, not since Laura died. She didn't ask more. He didn't explain. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of truce. After dinner, he offered to wash the dishes. She dried. When she reached for a plate and their hands brushed, neither pulled away, but neither said anything, either. Later that night, he stayed a little longer, sat near the fire. She noticed the way his shoulders dropped when he exhaled, like the weight he carried didn't entirely lift, but shifted just enough to be bearable. "I didn't build this place for guests," he said quietly, not looking at her. "I built it to be alone." Evelyn sipped her tea. "Then why let me stay?" He looked at her then, direct, measured, but not cold, "Because you're not a guest." She waited, for the rest of the sentence, for the reason, but he said nothing more. The next morning, he returned again, and the next. It became a rhythm, slow and deliberate. Caleb never overstayed, never imposed. But he came, sometimes with food, sometimes with stories, sometimes just to sit. There was something grounding about his presence even when it unnerved her. A week passed before the conversation changed. They were sitting near the fire again, late Saturday evening. Evelyn had just finished reading a chapter from a novel Caleb had brought. He poured more tea, then leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. She looked up. His face was unreadable. "I've spent the last decade building a company that will outlive me. Everything I own, everything I've done, it's meant to be passed on." She nodded, not quite sure where he was going. "I thought I'd have a family by now, that there'd be someone to inherit it, to carry it forward." He paused. "But I've realized something. I don't need marriage. I don't want another public spectacle. What I want is trust, stability, a life shared with someone who doesn't need me to perform." Evelyn's hands grew still on the mug in her lap. "I want a child," he said, "and I want you to consider being the mother." The room didn't move. The fire crackled once, then died into silence. She didn't speak. Couldn't. "No strings," he added quickly. "No expectations of marriage or romance. Just a choice. An agreement between two people who understand one another." She set her mug down slowly. So, what she finally said. "You want to sign a contract, schedule a pregnancy like a quarterly report." He didn't flinch. "No, nothing clinical, no pressure, just think about it. You're the only person I trust enough to ask." Evelyn stood up, more from instinct than decision. She walked toward the window, drew the curtain aside, and stared at the lake. It was fully frozen now, clean, perfect, untouched. Her reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, someone who'd learned to survive. Yes, but not someone who'd ever been invited to dream. The idea made her stomach twist. She turned back to him. "Do you see me as a person, Caleb, or a vessel?" His eyes met hers. "I see you as someone who's been through enough to know what she wants and what she doesn't." She didn't respond, not with words, just a slow, tired nod that didn't mean agreement but didn't mean no, either. Later that night, she lay awake in the bedroom upstairs. The cabin creaked gently in the wind. The fire downstairs had gone out, but the warmth still lingered. Outside, the snow fell without sound. The lake remained frozen, unbroken. Inside her, something stirred. Not an answer, not yet. Just a question that refused to leave, and the tiniest ache of possibility: silence. Evelyn had learned was often the safest thing. It filled spaces that words might wound. It protected boundaries and expectations, built invisible walls between one breath and the next. But in the days that followed Caleb's offer, something in that silence began to shift. It wasn't loud. It didn't break the air with declarations or demands. It moved gently like steam rising from a morning kettle, or the way fingers accidentally graze when reaching for the same spoon in a small kitchen. The cabin remained quiet, tucked in its snowy solitude beside the lake. But within its walls, something began to warm. Caleb didn't stay overnight, not yet, but he visited more often, a few hours on Tuesday evening, all day Saturday. Sometimes he arrived with groceries, sometimes just a loaf of bread or a book he thought she might enjoy. He never brought it up again, the offer. He didn't push, he didn't clarify, and that, in some strange way, made it harder to ignore. Evelyn began cleaning more than necessary. She re-hemmed the curtains in the living room, rearranged the spice rack in alphabetical order, sewed a patch into the fraying oven mitts. She wasn't nesting. That would have meant she was staying, but she was existing quietly, with a growing sense of rhythm she hadn't meant to adopt. One morning, she woke early and baked muffins. Just because. Caleb arrived that afternoon, just as she was tying back her hair. He stepped inside, dusting snow from his coat, and inhaled. Blueberry. She nodded, and lemon zest. He smiled. It wasn't wide. Caleb didn't smile that way, but it lingered longer than usual. They shared them over tea at the small table, snow falling outside the window in lazy spirals. Afterward, he pulled a weathered vinyl from the sleeve of his coat, thought this might work on the old record player. It was jazz Chet Baker, slow and smoky, the kind of music that asks nothing of you but presence. That night, they read near the fire. Evelyn curled into the armchair with her legs tucked beneath her. Caleb leaned back on the leather couch, a book in one hand, the other resting on the armrest where his fingers tapped to the rhythm of the music. They didn't speak much, but the silences between them had changed. They no longer hummed with tension. They simply were, and the glances they stayed longer, hung in the air just long enough to mean something, but not long enough to be questioned. One evening, as she stood at the stove stirring soup, Caleb reached around her to grab the salt. His hand brushed her shoulder light, fleeting, but it sent a ripple down her spine so subtle she nearly dropped the spoon. He didn't apologize, didn't explain, just returned to the counter and resumed slicing bread. And yet, for the rest of the night, Evelyn could feel the ghost of that touch. It was a Thursday when the power went out. A sudden gust of wind had rattled the windows all afternoon, and by sunset, the lights flickered once, then died completely. The heater sighed, fell silent, the cabin dimmed, the weight of winter settling in. Evelyn lit the oil lamps Caleb had shown her the week before. She pulled the wool blankets from the closet and piled them near the fireplace. The wood stove hissed to life with a little coaxing, warmth beginning to radiate slowly through the main room. Caleb had stayed late that evening. He didn't leave when the lights went out. He didn't even pretend to. They sat on the floor beside the fire, wrapped in blankets. The only sounds the occasional crack of wood and the low croon of wind outside. He read aloud for a while, his voice steady, low, oddly soothing. Evelyn didn't focus on the words so much as the way they filled the space, made the cabin feel smaller, closer. At some point, she leaned back into the cushions of the long chaise by the fireplace. She wasn't cold, not really, but she pulled the blanket tighter around her anyway. Caleb stood and disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, he returned with a thicker comforter. Without a word, he spread it gently over her, careful not to touch her directly. His movements were precise, respectful, but intentional. Evelyn watched him through half-lidded eyes, not sure whether to thank him or pretend she was already asleep. He didn't say goodnight, just sat back down on the rug, his back to her, staring into the fire. They didn't touch, but something passed between them in that hour. Not a promise, not yet, but the beginning of a surrender. Later, long after the fire had dimmed to glowing embers, Evelyn sat alone in the small bedroom upstairs. The mirror on the vanity reflected a pale outline of her face, softened by the golden flicker of the bedside lamp. Her hair was loose, her sweater stretched at the elbows. She looked real, tired, and alive. She reached up, almost unconsciously, and touched her collarbone. Just below it, that small space on her neck. Earlier that evening, as she had bent to light the fire, she'd caught him looking there, not leering, not possessive, just noticing. Like a man unsure whether beauty still existed in the world and suddenly realizing it did, her fingers hovered there for a moment longer. The silence wrapped around her again, but it no longer felt like hiding. It felt like the echo of something unspoken, and perhaps, just perhaps, something waiting to be born. There are glances you can look away from, touches you can pretend didn't happen, words that float between two people and dissolve before they take shape. But when someone makes you laugh, again, really laugh, the kind that bubbles up from a place long thought silent, it's harder to pretend. That's when you begin to realize you're no longer just surviving. You're beginning to feel. It was Saturday morning when Caleb asked if she wanted to go into town. Just a grocery run, he said, nothing more. The cabin needed more tea, salt, a few vegetables. The weather had finally softened, the snow thinning under the pale sun. Evelyn hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to step back into a world that hadn't missed her. But when he looked at her quiet, expectant, with no pressure, she found herself nodding. The drive was quiet at first. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, one hand resting loosely on the wheel. Evelyn watched the trees blur past, the sunlight catching patches of melting snow and scattering it like diamonds. She hadn't been to this part of town before, though she imagined he had many times. He parked in front of a small, family-owned market, tucked between a post office and a closed antique store. The sign was hand-painted, slightly faded. Inside, it smelled like citrus and coffee. Evelyn moved slowly through the aisles, touching things, reading labels. It wasn't about needing anything. It was about remembering that she could want something, even something small. A ceramic mug shaped like a fox, a lavender-scented candle with a cracked lid, a jar of orange marmalade with handwritten labels. She turned and caught Caleb watching her, not in the way men watched women, but in the way someone looks at a familiar song they haven't heard in years. When she raised an eyebrow, he cleared his throat and reached for a jar of pasta sauce. "This one's the worst. Don't buy it." She smiled. "Really? You seem like the kind of man who'd have strong opinions about tomatoes." He held up a hand. "Only about canned ones. Fresh tomatoes. I have a more complicated relationship with." She laughed, just a little, but it was the kind that crinkled her nose and lingered on her lips. He froze, just for a moment. Then he smiled back, not the polite, practiced kind he wore at board meetings, a real one. That night, after dinner, they sat by the fire again. Evelyn sipped chamomile tea while Caleb recounted his disastrous attempt at making soufflé early in his marriage. "I followed the recipe perfectly," he said, gesturing with mock offense, "measured everything to the gram. And somehow, it still collapsed like a sad balloon." Evelyn laughed, this time fully, unfiltered. It startled her. It startled him, too. He looked at her. Really looked. His eyes softened, like he wasn't just seeing her in that moment, but all the quiet pain she'd carried to get there, the shadows she no longer tried to hide. She felt it before she realized it, the shift in air, the way his gaze lingered on her lips, the fire flickering just enough to cast light on his face. outlining the faint crease between his brows, the one that only showed up when he was trying not to feel something. He leaned in slightly, not enough to break the space between them, but enough to acknowledge it existed. Her breath caught, neither moved. For one suspended second, Evelyn thought, maybe it's okay. Maybe this is it. But then, just as gently as he had leaned in, Caleb pulled back. He stood, slowly, his hands at his sides, steady. Too steady. "We should keep things clear," he said quietly, almost to himself. Evelyn didn't reply. What could she say? That clarity had never been her enemy until now, that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what came next, until he reminded her she should be. He didn't look at her again as he stepped out of the room. She listened to the quiet thud of his boots retreating down the hallway, then the door to the guest room closing with a softness that somehow made it worse. She sat there a long time. The tea in her cup grew cold. The fire dimmed. Still, she didn't move. Eventually, Evelyn stood and made her way to her room. She didn't bother turning on the lamp. Moonlight streamed in through the window, casting soft silver across the wooden floor. She walked to the vanity, sat slowly. Her reflection stared back, unreadable. She reached up and touched her lips, not because anything had happened, but because something almost had, and the space between almost and never was suddenly too much to bear. She had never thought of herself as a mother, not seriously, not with names or nurseries or soft lullabies in mind. That kind of dreaming belonged to other women, women who believed their bodies were safe places, women who had grown up knowing comfort. Evelyn Carter had never been one of them. So, when the second red line appeared on the test, faint but undeniably there, she didn't feel joy. She felt fear, not loud, screaming fear, but a quiet, breathless kind. The kind that settles low in your belly and makes your hands tremble even when they're not moving. The test lay on the edge of the sink, small and clinical. Beneath the mirror, her reflection blinked back pale, bare-faced, older than she remembered being yesterday. She stood there for a long time, arms wrapped tightly across her chest, as if holding herself might delay the truth another few seconds. But it didn't. She didn't tell Caleb, not that day, not the next. Instead, she began to write. A notebook she found in one of the cabin's drawers became her confessional. She didn't title it, didn't date the entries, just let her hand move. I don't know if this is a beginning or an end. I don't know if I should feel lucky or trapped. I don't even know if he'll care. Or worse, what if he cares the wrong way? What if, once he knows, I become the plan again, not the person? The days passed slowly. Caleb visited like usual, sometimes with fresh bread, other times with nothing but silence and the warmth of his company. He never pushed, never asked, never noticed the drawer where she slipped the notebook between the placemats. Evelyn cooked more, she cleaned more. She didn't know what nesting was supposed to feel like, but maybe this was it, or maybe it was just fear wearing an apron. At night, she lay in bed and counted her breaths. One for herself, one for someone else. The decision came on a Wednesday. Snow had fallen again, soft and thick, like memory. Caleb had left for a brief trip into the city, wouldn't be back until the next morning. Evelyn stood by the window most of the afternoon, one hand resting on her lower stomach. She didn't feel anything yet, no flutter, no change, but the idea of life whispered inside her like a quiet thread pulling taut. She pulled the suitcase from the back closet just before sunset. It wasn't the biggest one, but it would be enough. She packed slowly, methodically, a few sweaters, her scarf, the book Caleb gave her, toothbrush, socks, the notebook. She folded each item like a goodbye. On the desk by the window, she left a single sheet of paper. She hadn't signed it. I didn't plan this. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I need to find out if this child is something I want for me, or if I'm still just answering to what you needed. She placed the letter under a smooth river stone Caleb once used as a paperweight. Then she zipped the bag. She didn't cry, not yet, She was halfway down the stairs when she heard the front door open. For a moment, she thought it might be the wind, but then footsteps, heavy, familiar. Caleb. Her heart slammed into her ribs. She stood frozen on the fourth step from the bottom, suitcase beside her like a confession. He walked in, snow still clinging to the shoulders of his coat. He stopped when he saw her eyes falling to the bag, then slowly, carefully, back to her face. Neither spoke. The silence stretched long and sharp. Then finally, he said quietly, not a whisper, but something close to it. "You don't need to go." His voice didn't shake, but his eyes. His eyes were full of something that did. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it. The suitcase handle felt too heavy in her palm. "I didn't come back early to stop you," he added. "I didn't even know you'd be leaving." She said nothing. He stepped forward, slow and steady, not closing the space, but narrowing it. "You can leave if you want," he said. "I won't follow you. I won't chase." Another pause. "But if you're leaving because you think you're alone in this, you're not." Her fingers gripped the handle tighter. She didn't mean for her voice to crack, but it did. "I didn't want to be a condition." His brow furrowed. "I didn't want to become the reason you finally checked the box. The child. The legacy." Caleb's expression didn't harden. It softened. He nodded, once, then quietly. He said, "What if you were the reason I stopped thinking in checkboxes?" Evelyn felt the breath catch in her throat. Outside, the wind picked up again. Snow tapped softly against the windows. She looked at him, really looked. No mask, no calculated calm, just a man standing in front of her, asking nothing, offering something he didn't yet know how to name. And in that moment, she felt the suitcase grow lighter in her hand, not because it had fewer things, but because it no longer carried everything. That night, she didn't unpack. She left the suitcase by the door, still zipped, but she didn't leave. She stood at the kitchen counter, boiling water for tea, her hands no longer trembling. When Caleb sat beside her at the table, she didn't pull away. They didn't talk about the test, not yet. But the silence between them had changed again. It no longer guarded a secret. It held a possibility. Evelyn had never been good at saying how she felt. Words always failed her when spoken aloud, too clumsy, too exposed. But writing gave her space to breathe, to sort what tangled inside before it slipped too far from her grasp. So, she wrote a letter. Short but honest, folded it neatly and placed it at the center of the wooden kitchen table, that table, the one where they had shared dozens of quiet dinners and unspoken moments, the one where her tea always cooled too slowly and his glances lingered too long. She placed a small river stone atop it, the same one that once held another note, the one she never had to use. But this time, she meant to. Outside, the snow had started to fall. Caleb hadn't meant to return that evening. His business in the city was unfinished, his meeting postponed due to the weather. Still, something pulled at him, a quiet pressure in the chest, a sense not panic, not urgency, just an ache. He didn't tell his driver, didn't call ahead, just got into his car and drove. The road to the cabin was covered in fresh powder, tires slipping once or twice along the curves. The trees blurred in the headlights, branches heavy with frost. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky had darkened. Snow fell thicker now, wind pressing against the windows like a restless hand. He opened the door quietly, half expecting her curled up by the fire, reading, but what he found was silence, and the suitcase by the door, her coat folded neatly atop it, the letter on the table. He didn't touch it at first. He stood there, jaw tight, hands clenched, the kind of stillness that comes before something cracks. Then slowly, he stepped forward, picked up the page, and read. "You were never cruel, but you were never really here, either. You asked me to carry something precious but not to share it. I want more than safety. Caleb, I want to be wanted, Not needed, not used, wanted. And I don't think you know how to give that. The words hit harder than he expected. He sank into the chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. He didn't hear her footsteps on the stairs, didn't realize she'd come back down until she stood in the doorway, hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. Face unreadable. They stared at each other across the room, like strangers, like people who had once shared something unspoken and now found it all too loud. "You were leaving," he said finally. Evelyn didn't answer, just stepped forward and picked up the coat from the suitcase. "You weren't even going to say goodbye." She looked at him then, not coldly, not angrily, just tired. "I did." "You're holding it." His mouth opened, then closed. He stood, walked around the table. "I would have listened if you had just said something." She met his gaze. Would you have talked over it? Like you always do when things get close." The words stung. He didn't deny them. She moved to zip the suitcase, and his hand shot out, stopping her. Why now? After everything, her eyes welled, but the tears didn't fall. "Because I don't want to become a shadow in someone else's story," she whispered. "Not again, not even yours." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Caleb took a step back. "Everything I've done," he said, voice low, "has been to give you space, to let you choose." "You think that's nothing?" "No," Evelyn replied. "I think that's control disguised as kindness." The silence that followed was jagged, and then it broke. "I've lost before," Caleb said suddenly. "You think I don't know what it feels like to be left to love someone and watch them disappear by inches, every day, until they're just gone." He was breathing harder now. The words came rough. "She died in that house. Evelyn. And I kept showing up bringing her tea, fluffing pillows, talking about the weather while she looked through me like I'd already become memory." Evelyn's eyes softened. "I'm not her," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "But sometimes I act like you might vanish just as easily." His voice broke on the last word. She stepped toward him. "Then, maybe don't hold me like a glass you're afraid to drop." Something shifted in the room. Not anger, not forgiveness. Just the raw, exposed edge of two people finally speaking the truth. But before either could say more, the wind howled against the cabin with sudden force. Snow slapped the windows in sheets. The fire flickered and dimmed. Caleb turned, jaw tight. "I need air." Caleb. He was already at the door, coat in hand, stepping into the storm. Evelyn hesitated only a second. Then she ran after him. Outside, the world was white. The snow was nearly blinding, swirling in wild gusts. She could barely see 3 feet ahead. "Caleb," she shouted. Nothing. She pressed forward, boots sinking deep into the snowdrifts. Her breath came in sharp bursts, each inhale colder than the last. "Caleb," she called again, louder this time. A flicker of movement near the edge of the trees caught her eye. Then suddenly he was falling. It happened in a blink. His foot caught on a hidden root beneath the snow, his body twisting, arms flailing once before he hit the ground with a sickening thud. "Caleb." She stumbled forward, heart pounding. He lay motionless, snow quickly beginning to gather on his coat. She dropped beside him, brushing his face, calling his name over and over. His eyelids fluttered. A low groan escaped his lips. Relief hit her like a wave, but it didn't soften the panic. She pulled his head into her lap, hands cradling him gently. "Why would you walk into a storm?" she whispered, voice cracking. Caleb winced. "Didn't mean to go far." "Of course you didn't," she murmured. Then, lower, softer. "Don't teach me how to live without you. I'm no good at it." His eyes opened fully then, and for the first time, he didn't look like the CEO. He looked like a man, just a man, scared, exhausted, but finally present. Later, inside, she helped him out of his coat and sat him by the fire, wrapped him in the same blanket he once placed over her shoulders. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of silence settled. Not fear, not distance, just presence. Two hearts, still learning the rhythm of being near without running away. Caleb Whitmore didn't like hospitals. It wasn't just the sterile smell or the two white lights. It was the silence behind every beep, the quiet waiting rooms where time stretched long and thin. It was the memories, the ones that hit without warning. The last time he'd sat by a hospital bed, he'd held a hand that wouldn't squeeze back. And when they told him his wife was gone, along with the child she'd carried, he'd nodded, even as something inside him collapsed so silently it left no sound, only dust. So, when he opened his eyes this time, blinking against the soft morning light streaming through the slatted blinds, he expected that same emptiness. But instead, he saw her, Evelyn, curled in a chair beside the bed, arms wrapped around herself, still, watching him like he was something she wasn't sure she was allowed to want. Hope. That's what hit him first. And then the ache. She noticed the change in his breathing before he spoke. His fingers twitched lightly on the blanket, his brow furrowed, just a little. She sat up slowly, blinking sleep from her eyes. "You're awake," she said. Not a question, not relief, just quiet truth. He tried to sit up, but the stiffness in his shoulder pulled him back. "It's just a strain," she added quickly, "and some bruising. They said you were lucky." He let out a slow breath. His voice was hoarse. "You stayed?" Evelyn looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers in her lap. "I wasn't going to," she said honestly. "Not because I didn't care, because I cared too much." A pause, then, softer. "I was scared." "So was I," Caleb replied. For a while, neither spoke. A nurse entered briefly, checked his vitals, and left with a polite smile, closing the door behind her. The quiet returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It just was. "I never told you about her," Caleb said suddenly. Evelyn turned to look at him. He was staring at the ceiling, jaw tight, eyes distant. "My wife's name was Laura," he continued. "She was strong, the kind of woman who could hold a room without saying a word. We tried for years to have a child." He swallowed. She finally got pregnant. 6 months in, complications. They tried everything. His voice cracked at the edges. "I held her hand for 14 hours, and then they told me she was gone. Both of them." Evelyn's breath hitched. "I didn't cry," Caleb said. "Not then. I just went home, made tea, sat in the nursery that hadn't even been painted yet." He looked at her now, eyes heavy with something deeper than sorrow, and I told myself I wouldn't feel like that again. Wouldn't let anyone get close enough to take that much from me. He paused. "But then you walked into my office, asking for a file. I don't even remember what it was. I just remember thinking, God, she looks like she's already survived something." Evelyn blinked quickly. "You didn't have to fix me," she whispered. "I never needed you to." "I know," he said. "That's why I fell for you." She reached out then, not rushed, not dramatic, just placed her hand gently over his. His fingers didn't move for a second. Then they curled around hers, warm and certain. "I don't need you to love me perfectly," she said. "I just need you to mean it, to stop hiding from it." He stared at her, really looked, then slowly, like a man letting go of a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Caleb said, "I've loved you for longer than I've been willing to admit. I just didn't believe someone like you could choose someone like me after everything." Evelyn smiled, a little sad, a little whole. "I didn't choose you because you were perfect, Caleb." She paused. "I chose you because I saw the way you looked at broken things and didn't flinch." Later. A nurse brought breakfast. Caleb didn't touch it. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, shoulder to shoulder with him. No more distance. No more waiting for the other to break the silence. She leaned gently into him, resting her head against his arm. He didn't move, didn't speak, just let her be there. For the first time, there was no agreement, no condition, no if or when. Just two people who had spent too long hiding behind grief and were finally ready to step out of it, together. Some loves don't announce themselves loudly. They don't come crashing in with fireworks or sweeping gestures. They grow quietly, the way roots settle into soil beneath snow. Invisible to the eye, but undeniable, unshakable. That's how it was for Evelyn and Caleb. Back at the cabin, life didn't change in grand ways. There were no declarations taped to the fridge, no drawn-up timelines or promises carved into wood. But there was warmth, real warmth, that spread through the space like sunlight through thin curtains. The distance was gone. No more half-steps or polite silences. Now, they moved in rhythm, not rehearsed, just easy. They began preparing for the baby with slow, deliberate joy. One afternoon, Caleb carried in a wooden crib frame, something he'd picked up from a local craftsman in town. Evelyn watched him kneel on the cabin floor, reading the instructions with unnecessary intensity. "You know," she teased, "they say if you frown too hard at those pages, the crib might cry before the baby does." He looked up at her, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm trying not to put a bolt in backwards and end up with a crib that rocks itself into the wall." Evelyn sat beside him, knees tucked beneath her. She ran her hand over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. So is the person it's for," he said softly. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. They took trips to the small clinic in town. The nurse knew them by name, always offering peppermint tea while they waited. Caleb insisted on asking too many questions at each appointment about vitamins, breathing techniques, baby kicks. Evelyn teased him mercilessly, but never asked him to stop, because she knew for every question he asked, there was a quiet layer of fear beneath. And for every answer, a piece of that fear fell away. In the evenings, the cabin filled with smells of cinnamon and melting butter. Evelyn began baking more sweet breads, blueberry muffins, small pies just big enough for two. Caleb would lean on the counter, pretending to read while sneaking bites of raw dough. She would slap his hand away, half smiling, always failing to hide her amusement. Sometimes they read aloud to the baby, not children's books, yet, but pages from worn novels, poetry, even grocery lists. It didn't matter. Caleb claimed the baby liked the rhythm of his voice best. Evelyn rolled her eyes, but deep down, she agreed. The nights were mostly peaceful, but one evening, close to midnight, Evelyn woke with a sharp cramp in her leg, the kind that seized like a vice, freezing her in place. She let out a soft cry, and Caleb was up in an instant. He knelt beside the bed, his hands already reaching for hers. What is it? What's wrong?" She winced, gasped, tried to stretch. "Just a cramp. In my calf." But his eyes were wide, full of panic. "Is it the baby? Do we need to?" "No," she breathed. "Just help me stretch it." His hands moved carefully, supporting her ankle, gently straightening her leg. He whispered apologies she didn't need, reassurances she didn't ask for. When the pain subsided, she looked at him. His face was pale, like he'd come back from somewhere dark. "Caleb," she said softly. "I'm okay." He nodded, but didn't move. Then, as if pulled by something deeper than thought, he climbed into bed beside her and pulled her into his arms, careful not to press too hard against her belly. He held her like a man who'd almost lost something precious again. "I'm not going anywhere," she murmured into his chest. Still, he didn't speak. Not right away. Then, just above a whisper, he said, "I won't lose you. Not again. Not like last time." Evelyn closed her eyes, not because she was tired, but because his words wrapped around something inside her, something tender and long hidden. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean fully into another person's arms without needing a way out. The days grew colder, the wind sharper. But inside the cabin, there was a soft, unfolding warmth. Evelyn began humming while washing dishes. Caleb learned how to make her tea just right strong. A little honey, no lemon. They rearranged the bookshelf to make space for baby books they hadn't even bought yet. One morning, she stood before the small mirror in their bedroom, fingers grazing the curve of her growing belly. She didn't recognize her body, not completely, but she didn't fear it either, because for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own life. She belonged here, with him, with the tiny, steady heartbeat inside her. Caleb had never planned on being a father. Not again. The idea once held joy years ago, in another life. But after loss hollowed out that dream, he'd locked the door behind it, let it settle into dust, like an old book no one dared reopen. But today, as he stood in the hospital corridor, fingers clenched tightly around a foam coffee cup he hadn't touched, he realized something. That locked room, it had never stopped breathing. Evelyn had gone into labor just after dawn. She had shaken him gently awake, voice calm but tight, saying, "It's time." And then came the rush, the drive through early morning snow, her hand gripping his with quiet strength, the hospital lights, the blur of nurses, monitors, soft voices moving with practiced urgency. He stayed by her side for hours, 12, then 14. Every contraction twisted her features, but she barely made a sound. Caleb wanted to take the pain, to hold it in his chest and let her rest, but he couldn't. He could only stay, and he did. Through the sweat on her brow, the murmured encouragement, the way her hand found his even when her eyes couldn't. At one point, she drifted into a light sleep between contractions. Caleb stepped out into the hallway, needing air, but all he found was silence, sterile, still, the kind of silence that reminded him of another hospital, another hallway. He leaned against the wall, eyes shut. In his memory, Laura's room had smelled of lavender lotion and antiseptic. The nurse had held his hand as they explained what had gone wrong, as if words could cushion that kind of blow. He opened his eyes and stared down the corridor. "Please," he whispered inside. Not again. When the nurse came out and told him it was time, he moved before she finished the sentence. Inside, Evelyn was propped against pillows, damp curls clinging to her forehead. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were fierce. They met his, and something ancient passed between them: strength, trust, fear, love. He moved to her side, held her hand, and didn't let go. The delivery was hard, longer than expected. The baby's position wasn't ideal. The doctors moved with calm confidence, but Caleb could feel the tension under their words. He said nothing, just pressed his forehead to Evelyn's, whispering her name again and again, like it was the only word he knew. And then after a final cry from her lips, sharp and raw, a new sound filled the room. Thin, loud, pure, the cry of new life. They handed the baby to a nurse first, cleaned him, measured, wrapped him in a soft blue blanket. Caleb stood frozen, until a soft voice said, "Would you like to hold your son?" He turned, nodded, then carefully. Reverently he extended his arms, and for the first time they placed Elijah into them. He was small, so small, pink-cheeked, with a little furrow between his brows that looked far too serious for someone so new to the world. His fingers curled and uncurled in the air, as if grasping at nothing and everything. Caleb stared at him, and something inside him broke open. He didn't cry loudly, just once terror. Then another. They slipped down his cheek in silence, and one of them landed gently on Elijah's. He kissed the boy's forehead. "Hi," he whispered, voice rough. "I'm Caleb." The baby shifted slightly in his arms, making a soft cooing sound. Caleb smiled, trembling. "I'm your dad," he said, quieter now. "I didn't think I ever would be again. But your mom, she made me brave again." Another pause. "She taught me how to love, just by standing still." He glanced toward the bed. Evelyn watched him, eyes glassy, full. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. A little later, they were alone in the room. The nurse had dimmed the lights. Machines still beeped quietly, but everything else was still. Evelyn lay back, exhausted but awake, one hand resting on her stomach out of habit. Caleb sat in the chair beside her, Elijah sleeping against his chest. She looked at him, not at the suit, or the name, or the legacy, just him. And what she saw wasn't a CEO, not even a billionaire. She saw a man made entirely new by a weight he chose to carry. She saw love, real, undeniable, unspoken, and yet fully there. Weddings didn't need to be grand, not when the man standing beside you had seen your worst days when you'd cried in silence, doubted your own strength, and questioned your place in the world, not when he had held your hand through every crack and tremble, and still called it love. Evelyn never dreamed of ballrooms or diamond chandeliers. But on that soft spring afternoon, with wildflowers blooming in every corner of the backyard, she felt more like a bride than any fairy tale could have promised. The cabin had changed in small, quiet ways over the past few months. A second rocking chair on the porch, a baby blanket drying near the fire, a shelf of children's books tucked between Caleb's philosophy volumes. And now, strings of soft light stretched across the garden fence, casting a golden glow as the sun dipped behind the pines. The wildflowers had bloomed early that year, tiny bursts of yellow, purple, and white curling out from every patch of soil as if the earth itself had been waiting to celebrate with them. Evelyn stood beneath the old oak at the edge of the yard, wearing a simple ivory dress that brushed the grass. No veil, no train, just her, barefoot, free. There were only a dozen guest friends from town, the nurse from the clinic, and two of Caleb's oldest colleagues who'd driven up from the city in a rusty Jeep. Elijah sat in a woven cradle nearby, sound asleep in a little white romper, unaware that his parents were about to promise the rest of their lives to one another. When the music began, just a violin played by a neighbor's teenage daughter, Caleb stepped forward. No tuxedo. Just a soft gray shirt, sleeves rolled up, a sprig of lavender tucked into the breast pocket. He looked at Evelyn like the world had gone quiet, as if nothing else existed. They stood beneath the oak, just inches apart. The officiant said a few words, but Evelyn barely heard them. All she felt was the weight of Caleb's gaze, the warmth of the breeze, the thrum of her own heartbeat that somehow stayed steady, as if it had found its rhythm again. When it came time to speak their vows, Caleb cleared his throat, eyes shining with something deeper than tears. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, but after a moment, he let it fall to his side. "I had words," he said, voice low. "I wrote them all down, but standing here, I realize I don't need them." He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but into her. "I don't promise to always be strong," he said. "I've learned that strength isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stay even when you're afraid." He reached out, took her hand. "I promise to stay, even in the hard seasons, even when the cabin is too quiet, or the baby won't sleep, or we forget why we fell in love." A pause. "I promise to remember anyway, and to remind you, every day, that you are not alone." Evelyn's breath caught, not because of the words, but because they felt like home, like someone had taken the cracked pieces of her and laid them gently into place without trying to fix them, just holding them kindly. She didn't have anything written down, only a heart that had finally stopped running. She stepped closer, placed her hand on his chest, right over the place his heartbeat lived. "You once asked me to carry something precious," she said, "without promises, without a name for what we were." A soft smile pulled at her lips. "I didn't say yes because I had nowhere else to go." She paused. "I said yes because, somehow, I knew you wouldn't let me break alone." She glanced down at their hands. "Now, I say yes again, not because I need you to save me, but because I want to live beside someone who's been broken, too, and still stayed open." Her voice lowered. "We don't carry wounds anymore, Caleb. We carry love." The guests stood in silence, some smiling, some quietly crying, and when the officiant finally said, "You may kiss the bride," there was no hesitation. Caleb stepped forward, cupped Evelyn's face in both hands, and kissed her as though the world had ended and begun again in that moment. Later, as laughter filled the yard and glasses of sweet tea clinked gently in toasts, Evelyn sat on the porch swing, Elijah sleeping in her arms. Caleb joined her, sliding in close, resting his chin briefly on her shoulder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The stars were beginning to peek through the dusk. The wildflowers swayed softly in the breeze, and everything that had once been uncertain now felt anchored, gently, in place. He turned to her, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" he asked quietly. She raised an eyebrow, amused. "A woman who hasn't slept in 3 days." He chuckled. "No, I see the bravest thing I've ever known." Then, looking at their son, curled between them, and the greatest thing we've ever made. Evelyn leaned her head against him, a long, quiet breath, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was holding her world together alone. Not all happiness arrives with fireworks. Sometimes it slips in quietly on a breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers, in the creak of a porch swing, or in the weight of a small hand curled around your finger. Sometimes, it's just a warm afternoon by the lake. No grand declarations, just stillness. And the realization that, for the first time in your life, you're not bracing for something to fall apart. It was late summer, the kind where the air smelled faintly of pine and warm earth, and the sun lingered like it didn't want to leave. Caleb carried Elijah on his hip as they walked the narrow path toward the lake. Evelyn followed just behind, a woven basket in hand, filled with a small thermos of tea, 2 enamel mugs, and a soft blanket that smelled of cedarwood and sunlight. The lake shimmered in the distance, golden and glassy, framed by the low hum of cicadas and the soft rustle of leaves. Elijah babbled as he reached toward a dragonfly, his chubby fingers curling in wonder. Caleb smiled, shifting the baby slightly to free his other arm and point toward a patch of reeds. "See that? Bud. That's where the turtles like to nap." Elijah looked, wide-eyed. Evelyn caught up to them, breath slow and content. She didn't say anything, just watched them for a moment. Father and son. A picture that still made her chest tighten, not with fear anymore, but gratitude. They reached their favorite spot, a small grassy clearing by the edge of the water. Flat stones framed the bank, and an old wooden bench leaned slightly to one side, weathered but sturdy. Caleb spread the blanket as Evelyn sat, removing her sandals and curling her toes into the cool grass. Elijah sat between them, holding a small pine cone in both hands as if it were treasure. "Tea?" she asked. Caleb nodded, settling beside her. She poured it carefully, the scent of mint and honey rising into the air. He accepted the mug with a quiet thanks, his fingers brushing hers. Even now, after all this time, that simple contact still sparked something soft and quiet in her chest. He picked up the old guitar he kept by the cabin, fingers idly tuning the strings. Elijah looked up at the sound, smiling. Caleb began to play a slow, familiar melody, one he'd played for Evelyn months ago when the nights were long and uncertain. Now, with the sun low on the horizon, the notes seemed to stretch and settle over the lake like a lullaby. Evelyn leaned back on her hands, eyes closed, letting it all sink in the music, the warmth, the life they'd built. A life that hadn't been planned, but had become, somehow, perfect. She looked at Caleb then, noticed the faint lines near his eyes, the way his jaw relaxed when he was fully present. He looked older, yes, but not in a way that dimmed him. He looked lived in. He looked home. And for the first time, Evelyn let her mind drift backward fully, without flinching, to the underground garage, to the cold hand of fear on her spine, to the voice she'd never expected would become her safety. Caleb hadn't just stopped Randall, he had stopped her from disappearing entirely, from becoming a ghost in her own life. She watched as Elijah leaned against his father's knee, eyelids heavy, lulled by the strumming. She reached for the thermos, refilled their cups. and as the shadows lengthened, she spoke. "Do you remember the first time you saw me cry?" Caleb didn't stop playing, but his fingers slowed. "In the parking garage," he said softly. She nodded. "I wasn't crying because of Randall," she whispered. "I was crying because I realized I had no one to call, no one who would come." She looked at him. "But you did." He met her gaze. "I still would." The music faded. Elijah was asleep now, one tiny fist resting on his belly, his face flushed with peace. Caleb set the guitar down, leaned back beside her. Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder. A long silence settled over them. Not awkward, not empty, just whole. And then, in a voice only slightly louder than the breeze, she said, "You once told me you wanted an heir, someone to carry on your legacy." He smiled faintly. "Sounds like something I would have said." She looked at him now, not the man she'd met in a suit behind a glass desk, but the man who changed diapers in the dark, who learned how to make blueberry pancakes without burning them, who woke at the slightest sound of a baby's whimper. "You don't just have an heir." "Caleb," she said. She reached for his hand, entwining their fingers. "You have a family." He didn't answer right away, just turned his head, kissed her temple, and exhaled a breath that felt like years of walls crumbling gently. The lake rippled in the fading light. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a wind chime danced softly in the breeze. Later, as they packed up to head back to the cabin, Caleb paused. He looked out across the water, then down at Evelyn. "You know," he said, "I used to think healing meant becoming who I was before everything hurt." She looked at him, curious. "But now I think it means becoming someone new because of it." He glanced at Elijah, now cradled in Evelyn's arms. "And I like who I've become." Evelyn smiled. "So do I." That night, as they climbed the porch steps, Elijah stirred in her arms. She rocked him gently, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Inside, the cabin glowed with the soft light of evening lamps. The scent of lavender drifted from the nursery, and the door bore a new nameplate, one Caleb had carved himself. The Whitmores. Simple, uneven, human, real. In her journal later, Evelyn wrote, "Caleb saved me from Randall, but that's not what changed my life. What changed my life was this. He gave me a place where I didn't have to run anymore, a place to stay, a place to be loved. Sometimes, the most powerful love stories are not the ones that begin with passion, but with pain." Evelyn and Caleb's journey reminds us that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. It often arrives in silence, in the quiet presence of someone who chooses to stay. We may think we are too damaged, too late, or too old to begin again, but love has a gentle way of finding its way back when we least expect it. This story teaches us that strength is not in never being broken, but in allowing ourselves to be seen. Even with the cracks still showing, it reminds us that family isn't always built by blood, but by trust, forgiveness, and the small daily acts of care. In a world that often celebrates speed and perfection, Evelyn and Caleb show us the beauty of slow love, of second chances, and of choosing peace over fear. So, wherever you are in your life, whether starting over, grieving a loss, or learning how to trust again, remember this: it's never too late for love. And sometimes, love shows up in the quietest places. Thank you for spending your time with us and walking through this heartfelt journey. If this story touched your heart, made you feel seen, or reminded you that love and healing are still possible, please consider supporting our channel. Like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next story. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and never stop believing in second chances.